Final Fantasy XIV has one of the most active and challenging raid scenes in the MMO genre, evolving over the years from its early days of the Coils of Bahamut to Savage and Ultimate encounters. Of course, the game has also changed within the years, and I want to dive into the history of FF14's raid content, how it started, how it changed, and how it became the raiding scene that we know now. From the early raids of A Realm Reborn, the notorious difficulty spikes of Alexander, the game-changing mechanics of Shadowbringers, the game has changed so much. Whether you're a veteran raider or just curious about the journey, let's take a look at how Final Fantasy XIV's raiding scene has grown into what it is today. During the early release of this game, many things were still experimental and there were a lot of quality of life stuff missing. There weren't a lot of job variety, in fact there were only 2 tanks, 2 melee DPS, a singular ranged DPS, 2 magical ranged DPS, 1 barrier and 1 pure healer. There was no party finder, players had to actually travel to the location of the raid to get a party with others manually. Cooldowns were also not reset when the group wiped, meaning that if your paladin used hallowed ground and then the party wiped right after, well, yeah. To unlock some jobs, you would have to level other jobs to level 15 first. There were cross-class abilities too, so you would have to level other jobs in order to get that job's cross-class ability. Some of these abilities included just slightly important abilities. There was a minimum accuracy threshold for the front, side, and rear of the bosses, and if you didn't meet the threshold, then your attacks would miss the boss. The server tick rate was also atrocious and played a decently large portion in the early difficulties of raids. In short, the game was very different, but I digress. The first set of raids to ever release were the Coils of Bahamut, which came out with the first patch 2.0, A Realm Reborn. The Coils were split into 3 separate tiers: the Binding Coil of Bahamut, the second Coil of Bahamut, and the final Coil of Bahamut. These were level 50 raids with a minimum item level of 82. Lore-wise, the Coils was very significant. Final Fantasy XIV canonically takes place after a war called the Battle of Carthanel, a massive scale battle between the allied forces of Eorzea and the Imperial Legion of the Gallian Empire. In this war, the legatus of the Imperial Legion, Neo Vandanus, hatched a plot to crash Thalum, the Red Moon, into Eorzea. As the battle raged on, eventually Neo was defeated by the allied forces, however it was too late to stop Thalum's advance. As the moon came closer and closer, both sides watched as Thalum unexpectedly broke before their very eyes, revealing something nobody could have foreseen. Having been sealed within Thalum with forgotten technology since the ancient times of the Alangan Empire, the elder primal Bahamut emerged from his prison. Enraged after eons of duress, Bahamut unleashed his wrath upon Eorzea with Gigaflare, causing endless fire and destruction. Louisoix, one of Eorzea's most respected sages and Archon, conjured a barrier to protect what was left of the continent and began an arcane rite to channel the power of the 12, focusing the power into a new rebinding targeted towards Bahamut. Seeing this, nations from all over Eorzea joined in the hopes of containing this beast. However, this was in vain as Bahamut was too strong and broke free, and started channeling its most powerful attack, Terraflare. Louisoix, knowing all hope was over, gathers up all the ether from the bindings, prays from thousands of Eorzeans, and takes to the skies in the form of the primal phoenix. In the etheric shield of the phoenix, Louisoix crystallized Terraflare and pierced Bahamut's chest. Weakened and with all its aether spent, Louisoix crystallized and shattered along with the crystallized Terraflare, raining down destruction upon Mordona and ending the 6th Umbral Era. This raid series serves as a closure to the events of this war, discovering the fate of Bahamut and Louisoix and ensuring that the Gallian forces do not obtain the Alangan technology that Thalum's still active defensive system possesses. The coils will turn T1 to T13, or turn 1 to turn 13, each turn representing a specific instance. The early raids in Final Fantasy XIV were interesting. It's clear that the concepts and overall design of the raids were vastly different than the raids we have now. Nowadays, each raid tends to be a singular boss fight. This has been the case ever since Stormblood with the release of Deltascape, but beforehand, in A Realm Reborn and Heavensward, the raids were designed a bit more like World of Warcraft dungeons where there would be several objectives you had to complete with adds and bosses along the way. It's impossible to reflect on how exactly difficult the Coils of Bahamut were, as over the years multiple things have changed. System mechanics have been overhauled, jobs are completely different now than back then, the netcode was way worse, etc. But it's common belief that the normal Coils of Bahamut raids are comparable to later Savage tiers. The Binding Coil of Bahamut was the first tier in this raid series and was the first raid to ever be released in Final Fantasy XIV. This tier consisted of 5 turns and is special because this is the only tier in the game that has 5 fights, as all future raid tiers have 4. As you can see, the raid tier played out more like dungeons in FF nowadays. In fact, T1 has 2 bosses, T2 has multiple bosses depending on the route you take, T3 didn't even have a boss and was more like a jumping puzzle, and T4 was a gauntlet fight consisting of waves of mobs. There was a lot of variety in terms of raid design. The only turn that is somewhat similar to the raids we have now was T5, which consisted of a singular boss and 3 smaller adds, Tuntania and Hemerasidia adds. The usage of the term phase here has significance though. When thinking of more recent fights that have phases, some examples being M4S, Fru, DSR, etc., a phase is almost always accompanied by a large transition of some sort. In M4S, it was Wicked Thunder transforming and knocking all the players back onto a separate platform. In Fru, well, there's 5 phases and each is accompanied by a large downtime window and occasionally an in-game cutscene like the intermission from P2 to P3. The same in DSR. Tuntania didn't have phases in this sense. In fact, there was no downtime or cutscene that played at all. It simply just changed phases when the HP reached a predetermined number, 85% for phase 2, 55% for phase 3, etc., where Tuntania would start casting new moves. One of the most annoying moves in this fight was Twisters, where Tuntania would place green swirl indicators under players, and if you stayed in it for too long, then you'd instantly die. It wasn't actually the mechanics itself that was difficult, but more so the server tick and latency issues causing lag. Even if you visually clearly dodged the Twister, you could still die due to a bad tick. The second Coil of Bahamut was the second raid tier in this series, consisting of T6 to T9, and was somewhat strange in that it had both a normal version and a savage version. The normal version was released on March 27, 2014, and the savage was released roughly 3 months after on July 8, 2014. Obviously in modern FF this is to be expected, but in the context of the Coil specifically, it was actually quite strange to have 2 versions of a raid tier. As mentioned previously, this is because the normal versions of the raids were already judged to have a difficulty from somewhere between extremes and savages. In fact, none of the Coils of Bahamut are included in the roulette of this game because of that reason. It's simply too hard to include in a casual daily roulette. The savage version of this tier was an unshoot version of the fights, and even the developers weren't sure if they were even clearable. This was essentially the developers' early attempt and testing of a potential new ultimate level difficulty. This raid tier followed similar design of the last tier, although there was less ad management. The most notable fights in this tier were T9 Normal and T7 Savage, especially T7S, which was considered as one of the most difficult pieces of content until Ultimates. T9N faced you off against Nail Desdanis and was a mechanic fest which demanded more from individual players with respect to their personal responsibilities and movement. T7S was incredibly difficult as everything needed to be done at the right time. The petrification mechanics were pretty much guaranteed deaths if you got hit by them, and all it took was one mistake from anyone to snowball it into a wipe. Even during a large portion of Heavensward and early Stormblood, the only way to beat this floor unsynced was to have enough DPS to kill the boss before she did any mechanic. The normal version of this fight was difficult, but the players quickly developed cheese strats for some of the mechanics that made it easier. For example, a very common strat was to have a summoner or bard kite the Renault adds around the map and slow them with their dots. The healers would then freeze it in place, and once 4 Renaults have this happen to them, they would stop spawning. In the Savage version though, the developers designed this fight so that all the cheese strats that worked in the normal version would be obsolete. That Renault strategy mentioned before, yeah, it didn't work because 2 Renaults spawn at once and they don't stop spawning. Getting auto-attacked by any of the Renaults would be an instant death as well. The final Coil of Bahamut is the final raid tier of A Realm Reborn, consisting of T9 to T13, released on October 28, 2014. Notable fights included T11 and T13. T11 was very inconsistent due to tether mechanics, hard-hitting cleaves, and an adds phase with a proximity mechanic. I don't really think I need to expand more about doing tethers with bad netcode, it's just a really bad experience. T13 faced you off with Bahamut Prime. This fight was all about reacting to repeating mechanics in each phase and properly mitigating heavy hitting attacks. Rather than the difficulty coming from the mechanics like in T9, the difficulty came from the harsh penalties if someone had failed a mechanic. If you died, you lost 25% of all your stats. And you might be thinking, isn't that what happens nowadays as well? But this is not true because back in the day, it was literally all of your stats. This included even your HP, so if you died, then you would have less max HP and would be vulnerable to getting one-shot by mechanics even if you did them correctly. Back then, both tanks and healers had to swap between two stances, a DPS and a tank stance for tanks, or a DPS and a heal stance for healers. For tanks, these stances changed enmity generation and mitigation. For example, paladins had Sword Oath, the DPS stance, increasing the potency of their auto attacks by 50. The tank stance Shield Oath, on the other hand, reduced your damage taken by 25% and increased your enmity gain, but also reduced your damage dealt by 30%. Warrior didn't really have a DPS stance per se, but had Defiance, which raised their max HP by 25% and increased enmity gain while reducing damage dealt by 35%. Using certain actions under Defiance would also build Wrath stacks, each of which will grant 2% crit rate. So if you wanted to deal more damage, you would turn off Defiance, but if you wanted to gain more enmity, then you would turn it on. For healers, they had Cleric stance, which was a stance you could turn on to deal more damage but cut your healing. Many key mitigation abilities also didn't even exist. For example, Reprisal was only added in Heaven's Ward and was a Dark Knight exclusive skill that could only be used after a parry. The move itself was different too. Anyway, the point is that mitigation was more difficult and unique, and different jobs would have to align their cooldowns appropriately. This entire fight hurt a lot, and massive stress was put on healers to keep the party alive. There's a hard enrage timer on this fight at 14 minutes, where Bahamut Prime will cast a 15-second long cast Giga Flare, which will wipe the party. T13 also had arguably the most epic transition in FF14 raiding history in my opinion, from Phase 3 to Phase 4, in the form of Bahamut's most iconic move, Terra Flare. The Coil of Bahamut was pretty well received. It had incredible story and music extending upon the finality of FF14 1.0. It also had very unique environments and fight design, each time being vastly different from the last. That being the case though, many players expressed that they felt the final Coil of Bahamut was too easy when compared to the second Coil fights. And more casual players who were interested in the story also voiced their concern about not being able to experience the content since it was too difficult. This in turn made Square Enix decide to differentiate between normal raids, which were aimed at the casual player base to ensure that they could still experience the story, and Savage raids, which were aimed at the more hardcore player base. Whilst Heaven's Ward is generally renowned nowadays for its incredible story, this couldn't be further from the truth for high-end raiders. In fact, this expansion is probably the absolute worst out of all the expansions so far in terms of raiding. Heaven's Ward brought alongside the Alexander raids, otherwise known as A1 to A12, and also brought perhaps the most infamous raid tier to date for players who've stuck around since then. Many significant actions were added or changed. Warriors got an actual DPS stance called Deliverance, along with Paladins got Divine Veil, which was a party-wide mitt, and Sheltron, which guaranteed a block on the next physical attack. This ended up not being very useful though, as these raids were magical. Dark Knight had Reprisal, which was an OGCD that dealt 210 potency to the target, and lowered the target's damage by 10% for 20 seconds. The move itself had a 30-second cooldown, but could only be used after parrying. Melees like Dragoon and Monk had more positionals than ever, and was difficult to play. If any melee missed their positionals, it would break their combo, so it was very punishing. Healers got a new addition to their roster, Astrologian, which was interesting because instead of being a pure or a shield healer, it could do both. It had two stances, Diurnal Sect, which gave regen healing like White Mages, and Nocturnal Sect, which gave shield-based healing like Scholars. It also had a unique card draw mechanic which relied on RNG, where it would draw a random card out of 6 available cards to buff a party member. Ranged DPS got a caster stance, which made them cast their skills to deal more damage? Yeah, I don't really know what they were cooking either. And much more, like the introduction of Diadem and random stats on dropped gear, but enough of that. Let's talk about the raid tier now. Ages ago, Alexander was designed by the author of the Enigma Codex as a haven for scientists and philosophers to research the mysteries of life. 2 years after the start of the 7th Umbral Era, a group of Aura attempted to summon Alexander using this Enigma Codex. However, something went wrong and the Enigma Codex exploded. Alexander rose up, killing most of the group, and began to absorb massive amounts of ether from the surrounding land. Mide, an Aura from the previously mentioned group of Auras, almost gets sucked into Alexander, but Mide's boyfriend Diane shoves her out of the way and gets pulled in herself. As the last survivor, Mide executed their backup plan and conjured a barrier around Alexander. She hands a piece of the codex to the leader of the Illuminati, Quick Things, in hopes that they can summon the Alexander so that she can get inside and search for Diane. And this is where you come into play. Alexander is summoned, and Sid calls for your help to contain this primal. You head inside Alexander alongside Mide to figure out what's really happening. The most infamous raid tier in the game's history, Alexander Gordias, was denoted A1S to A4S and was the first raid tier of Heavensward, released on July 7th, 2015. It was so brutal that it almost killed high-end raiding in Final Fantasy XIV, cutting the raid scene by more than half. Coming from the final coils, which were rather easy, the general player base were convinced that they were good enough to tackle high-end raiding. And this tier put a lot of those dreams to rest. This was the first tier in which every fight now had a hard enrage timer. In Coils, some fights had soft enrages which you could still clear through, and only a few fights like T9 and T13 had hard enrages. This put emphasis on DPS, which often prevented the weaker jobs from getting a spot in the party. Paladins, monks, and astrologans were almost non-existent in raiding as they were outshined by other jobs like warriors, dragoons, and scholars. Warriors in particular were so strong that it rivaled DPS damage output with Felcleave spamming. This imbalance of jobs essentially had every party be consisted of Dragoon, Ninja, Bard, and Machinist. Dragoon's Disembowel used to decrease the target's piercing resistance by 5%, essentially giving a buff to both the Bard and the Machinist, and Ninja's Trick Attack was the best it had ever been. Gordias had insanely tight and difficult DPS checks to the point where it was almost impossible to clear on the first week, as your gear wouldn't be good enough since crafted gear didn't exist. Oftentimes, to meet the DPS check, tanks would equip DPS accessories and optimize their DPS stance uptime to deal extra damage. This was very odd to do as tanks couldn't roll need on strength accessories but could still buy them. This eventually brought up controversies about role identity. Tanks were supposed to be, well, tanks, providing utility and dealing less damage than the DPS. Yet a large majority of actions that were added, Deliverance and Felcleave for Warrior, Goring Blade and Royal Authority for Paladin, Asai's Broil and Astrocast of Healers all pointed to one clear message, that DPS is king. This in turn led to other problems, like since tanks were now taking strength accessories instead of vitality, the mechanics would hit much harder and healers would have to lock the fuck in so that their party doesn't just die to damage. The entire tier was very hard, but the most infamous fight has to go to A3S, Living Liquid, being known as the Static Breaker. Living Liquid was the fight that was known to break the most statics in the history of the game until DSR all the way in Endwalker. This boss had an extremely tight enrage timer, and you would need full uptime and perfect rotations to make it. One of the most painful mechanics in this fight was Digititis, where a random tank, DPS, and healer will be targeted. As the cast goes off, a 90% damage down buff will be applied to the DPS, a 90% healing down debuff will be given to the healer, and a vulnerability up will be applied to the tank. Players must swap these debuffs to avoid the detrimental effects on each roll. For example, the vulnerability up debuff should be given to the DPS. These debuffs must be swapped extremely quickly as the first debuffs have a timer of 5 seconds, in which afterwards they become impossible. The difficulty of this mechanic isn't necessarily that the mechanic itself was hard, but rather that the netcode was so bad that it was difficult to actually get the passes to properly work. If any of the debuffs were passed incorrectly, then it was a guaranteed wipe as either the DPS check wouldn't be met, or there wouldn't be enough healings, or players would just get one-shot by having the Vuln up stack. This is also the fight that introduced two popular reused mechanics, Hand of Pain, which required two enemies to be brought within a specific percentage HP difference between each other, and Protean Baits, which is targeted on the closest X number of players. The fight after this, A4S the Manipulator, was similarly insane difficult, but less well known than Living Liquid. Following the Gordias raid tier, Square Enix was met with tons of backlash, complaining that the raid was too difficult and badly designed. It was common sentiment that the tier was way too hard and was way too unfriendly for casual and mid-core players. The discrimination against weaker jobs didn't help in this either. Many thought the mechanics felt too chaotic or unfun, especially Living Liquid's clone phase or Brute Justice's overlapping mechanics. A lot of statics cleared A1S and quit the tier after seeing A2S or A3S. There were still of course players who loved this though. High-end raiders enjoyed the challenges of these raids as a push for optimal performance in rotation, uptime, and mechanics. It practically served as a wake-up call that Savage isn't for everyone. However, there was enough backlash and negative feedback that Square Enix acknowledged that Gordias was too difficult and that they would adjust future raid tiers. Alexander Midas followed Gordias with a ton of job changes that shifted the meta. Weaker jobs that were discriminated against in Gordias got buffs that allowed them to play the game again. Astro's card system got adjusted for more consistency and got some MP cost reduction, finally getting the buffs that it needed to be relevant in Savage. This tier wasn't a walk in the park either, as mechanically speaking, the difficulty is probably around the same or even harder just because of A8S. It was just easier because the jobs were better balanced and the DPS check was nerfed a little bit so that you don't need an absolute perfect performance to clear. The gear check was more lenient as crafted gear was now accessible and much stronger than before. The fights were well paced and more learnable than Gordias, mechanics were tough but more fair as opposed to failing due to shitty netcode or bad snapshots. The most difficult fight of this tier was A8S, Brute Justice and Cruise Chaser, which is probably the most mechanically challenging fight to date with respect to when it first got released. This fight had two things that stood out. The first is there are many distinct phases, 7 to be exact. That's as many phases as DSR, which has the most phases in any Ultimate ever released. And two, that the phases are very different from each other. The transitions and ad phase in particular were difficult phases that warred many players for a while as there are a lot of things to look out for, chakrams, robots, mines, etc. One of the mechanics in the last phase, the gavel, was meant to be very difficult to figure out and plan for, but somehow someone in the World First group had a stroke of divine light or something and came up with a solution that basically solved everything. The feedback on Midas was overwhelmingly positive, especially when compared to previous receptions towards Gordias. This raid tier is often remembered to be one of the best designed tiers in the game's history as it was both mechanically challenging and engaging without being unfair. Though the meta still had some issues, warriors and astrologians were absolute dominators, the DPS check being more lenient due to better gearing allowed the participation of more jobs in Savage raids. And finally, Alexander the Creator, the last tier of Heaven's Ward. This tier was a lot simpler in complexity and difficulty. This was seen clearly in the first two fights of the tier, A9S and A10S, where bosses weren't nearly as challenging as the previous two tiers. A11S Cruise Chaser however stood its ground as a timeless fight due to its complex and memorable mechanics. Similar to fights in Midas, this fight was mechanically difficult but had heaps of mechanics that could wipe the party and had a lot of HP. This fight also rewarded good DPS as you were able to skip certain mechanics, most notably Phase 3's final limit cut, which will give the boss a damage up buff, making the fight longer. Arguably the most infamous mechanic in this fight was in Phase 2, called Limit Cut. Every player would be marked with a marker 1 to 8 and the boss would dash to odd numbers and cleave in the direction of even numbers. This mech had to be performed flawlessly, otherwise it would often lead into a wipe. And finally, A12, Alexander Prime. This was a hard fight, though not quite as hard as A8S and not quite as bullshit as A4S. Temporal Stasis was a mechanic where players were completely frozen for 8 seconds and received specific debuffs that require the players to participate in specific mechanics. And Judgment Crystal were crystals that would be intermittently placed as the fights progressed. These were necessary because the boss would teleport away at certain intervals of the fight, and these would tell you where Alexander would spawn. This tier was a big step down in difficulty when compared to Gordias and Midas, something that needed to eventually happen as those two tiers left the scene so broken that they hadn't recovered even all the way until the end of Shadowbringers. An important detail to note here is that this was the first tier that introduced Cross-World Party Finder. Smaller servers finally had a way to connect with the raiding servers, allowing for more players to work together to progress the tier. The release of Stormblood saw a shift in the design of Final Fantasy XIV raiding. In both A Realm Reborn and Heaven's Ward, raids would often have multiple objectives and trash packs between each boss. From the Omega raids onwards, all fights solely consist of one boss and you load straight into the instance. The design of mechanics also changed, leaning into more clear telegraphs and execution-based challenges rather than obscure logic puzzles. The combat system itself also got some pretty substantial changes. Cross-class actions were removed and replaced by role actions, so now Reprisal, rather than being a Dark Knight exclusive skill, can be used by all tanks and the skill itself was changed. The accuracy stat I mentioned before that was a requirement got changed to direct hit, so now players didn't have to worry about getting minimum accuracy. Job gauges were added this patch. Yeah, FF14 didn't have job gauges before Stormblood, and the actions that require the gauge now, like Fell Cleave, used to only be able to be used in specific states, like Uncontrolled. And along with these system changes came a new raid tier, the Omega raids. A lot about Omega is shrouded in mystery. It is an ancient weapon employed by the Alangan Empire to capture Bahamut, and it remained in an eras-long stasis, until recently when it was awakened to contend with the threat of another primal. By the actions of Illbird Fear, a dread primal had manifested in the skies above Balzer's wall. Confronted with the possibility of another calamity, the Eorzean Reliance resorted to a desperate maneuver, activating Omega. After eons in slumber, Omega awoke and identified the primal as the target. However, as the mechanical beast moved to attack, a creature burst out from its prison, a draconic being, Shinryu. The two entities engaged in a furious battle, which ended when both of them crashed down in Girabania amidst a blinding explosion and disappeared. As overseers of Omega's activation, Sid and the Ironworks were tasked with finding the missing weapon. However, despite the Ironworks' best effort, Omega remained elusive. Shinryu was found and was subsequently vanquished by the Warrior of Light, but there was not so much as a trace of Omega. Just as finding Omega seemed to be impossible, suddenly came a lead. Etheric readings were observed to have risen to alarming levels at the Yawn, the massive crater in the fringes where Omega and Shinryu had fallen together. And so, Sid, the Ironworks, and the Warrior of Light set out for this crater in search of Omega. The players who were disappointed with how easy Alexander the Creator was wouldn't be impressed by this tier either. In fact, O1S is actually a pretty significant fight in the game's history as one of the game's easiest, if not the easiest Savage fight. The Savage version of this fight simply hit harder, a bit faster, and the telegraphs were more vague. As a result of this, the fight was cleared in literally the first pull and to this day remains the only Savage to be done so. O2S wasn't particularly special either, again increasing numbers and making telegraphs more difficult to read. O3 and O4 however, we can talk about. O3S is a fan favorite among the entire Omega Raid series and was considerably harder than the last two, although that doesn't really mean much. The mechanics in this fight were more creative than the fights before and even when compared to a tier like Midas. Unlike the previous third fights, this had a lot more mechanics to deal with, a lot being visual and interactive. The boss would constantly change scenery depending on its location on the arena and also summon adds, unlike the last tiers which finally gave the off-tank something to do other than a tank swap. This fight had 5 phases split into different sceneries: Standard, Forest, Cave, Library, and lastly a mix of the other phases. It also introduced an interesting mechanic Mindjack, which gives your character a forward, back, left, right march, later causing your character to move in that direction. Overall, it was a very interesting fight that had unique mechanics and posed a good challenge that players loved. O4 faced you off with X-Death, which was the first door boss in the game. It had much less HP than the previous encounters and was a mechanic dance for 4 minutes. The mechanics go up very fast and players didn't have much time to stand around in a singular spot. World First racers were theorizing that something was wrong with the boss as it often enraged at around 75%. Eventually, a group pushed X-Death to 60% before Enrage and witnessed the game's first cinematic transition. Neo X-Death was a unique boss in that it didn't auto-attack, and instead the mechanics just did a lot of damage. The most notorious showcase of this being Almagest, a raid wide that does an immense amount of damage and inflicts a very heavy dot on the entire party. The party pretty much had to kitchen sink all mitts into this mechanic and spam heal through the dots afterwards. Another notorious mechanic is Grand Cross, which has 3 variants: Alpha, Delta, and Omega. Each of these variants require a long and complex method of solving, and since all the names are somewhat similar, it wouldn't be uncommon for players to pre-position for the wrong variant, wiping the party. This fight hit hard, and although it wasn't exactly the most difficult final fight, it showed that Square Enix had a direction of making the first tier more accessible, whilst also balancing the fight's difficulties in a healthy way. The community's reaction to this tier was mixed however, as some people hated the drop in difficulty, calling it the weakest tier to have been released. O3S however was universally loved by all players and is still considered one of the best Savage fights. With the release of patch 4.2 came along the biggest job balance update in Stormblood. Many jobs were tuned to be more in line with each other, but the most notable change was probably Warrior. This patch changed the way inner release worked, allowing warriors to use it more offensively. This was kind of almost a mini rework and resulted in the meme that all warriors do is press Felkly 5 times, which isn't exactly inaccurate as inner release became like 40% of your damage. This tier, like the last tier, had 2 easier fights followed by 2 harder fights, kind of like a mixed bag. That being said though, you can't deny how good visually it looks, and how even some of the mechanics interact with the environment. I mean, just look at 05 Phantom Train. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think this is the only fight in the game where you're on a constantly physically moving environment. This fight had a mechanic where all the party members needed to be teleported to kill their own ad, but a cheat strat was developed that took advantage of Warrior's new inner release. Instead of the party members teleporting, the warrior can just teleport alone and use inner release to kill their ad before the party die to the DPS check debuff. The mechanics in this tier were cool as well. For example, in 06, there are several paintings on the ground where you'll have to interact with for certain mechanics. 05 was a significant step up from last year's first boss, but 06 somehow regressed in difficulty and was something similar to 01. 07 and 08 were considered the two harder fights of the tier. 07 faced you off with Guardian, and design-wise the fight is quite interesting. There are monitors on the outside of the arena that will display an image that represents which program is being loaded. There are 4 possible programs: Dardaluma, Ultros, Air Force, and Bibliotaph. Each of these programs will have their own set of mechanics, but to add an extra layer on top, these mechanics can also be modified with various commands that the boss casts. For example, copy program is a cast which causes the boss to make a copy of the currently active program, which it will eventually paste program later in the encounter. And to make things interesting, this fight isn't exactly solved either, meaning that players wouldn't be able to do the exact same movements every single pull. Following the trend, 08 had 2 phases, the first phase being a door, and the second being consisted of 3 mini phases. Mechanically speaking, it wasn't as intensive as 04, but it wasn't a cakewalk either, with the boss hitting very hard with multiple mitigation and healing checks. The first cast in phase 2, Heartless Angel, sets all players HP to 1 and is followed up by a heavy raid wide into a tank buster. Healers would have to immediately top up the raid to prevent mass stats. Each of the mini phases also had their own set of mechanics as well, making this fight quite a bit more difficult than the first 2 floors. This tier marked the end of a lot of experimentation done by Square Enix in terms of Savage fights. From Alexander the Creator tier onwards, Square Enix had been experimenting with quite a lot of different types of mechanics, and this tier marked the end of it. 05 was the last time that an in-fight loading zone was used in Savage. This may be due to consideration of the player's specs that they were playing on. 06 was the last time that a vehicle segment was used in any high-end fight, specifically talking about Possession, Demon Fire, Demon Earth, and Goddess Water, which is a combination of mechanics that players needed to solve. A part of the way to solve this required players to collect black paint and use it in front of the earth painting to summon Air Force mounts, allowing players to elevate up the floor during an upcoming seismic earthquake. That being said, this fight also kind of marked the end of duty actions in Savage fights as well. I say kind of because the main tank needed to use it later in a Shadowbringers Savage fight, but that's really it. And finally, 07 was the last time that a boss would spawn ads, be targetable, and still do mechanics at the same time. Even in the second floor of the most recent tier, AAC Cruiserweight, which is quite a notorious ad phase, the boss still doesn't do anything except auto attacks. I guess there is a raid wipe at the very end of the phase, but that's just to mark the end of the phase itself, and not really what I would consider an actual mechanic. Community reception to this tier was mixed, and I feel a large part of this may be attributed to the release of UCOP in 4.1. Groups that cleared UCOP or got far into the fight now played on a higher level than Savage tiers, and the first 2 fights really did take this tier down a notch. The meta didn't really change much in this patch. The top picks mostly remained the same. 09 Chaos introduces elemental mechanics requiring players to adapt to shifting arena conditions. Quite an interesting concept and fun to learn. Although this fight was quite easy as well, when compared to the other first floors in Stormblood, it pulled ahead quite a bit. 010 features Midgardsormr utilizing flip mechanics, where the boss's orientation affects the execution of abilities. You had to interpret the visual cues to position correctly in order to avoid damage. Hot Tail was a wall in this fight, which is indicated by Midgardsormr tethering himself to a random player. After a delay, Midgard will launch a fatal straight line AoE through himself in the direction of the marked player. Both the initial attack and straight line AoE can only be survived by dodging the blast entirely or by acquiring Crumbling Bulwark, which was a buff as a result of a previous mechanic. So the player with the Crumbling Bulwark would take the tether and position in a way that didn't cleave the rest of the party. 011 Omega employs a series of pretty complex mechanics, including executable sequences that test players' memory and coordination. This fight was fast paced and required precise execution. Finally, arguably one of the best door bosses, 012S's Male-Female. This door boss had a lot of moving parts, more variation, and required more things to learn than the other bosses. Omega, the phase 2 boss, was amazing as well, with one of my personal favorite boss themes in the game. In terms of difficulty, perhaps it was somewhat similar to the other final bosses. Hello World 2 was definitely the mechanic in this fight, which causes Omega to teleport to the center and bombard the raid with unavoidable damage and debuffs. These debuffs would have to be solved in a particular way, and so all the party members would have to successfully complete a dance-like routine that was very satisfying when pulled off. Alphascape was probably the most well-received raid tier in Stormblood, as all the fights were pretty interesting and fun. Shadowbringers changed a lot of core system mechanics. One of the primary goals of Shadowbringers was to streamline job kits and improve job clarity without sacrificing job depth. Some jobs were overhauled whilst others received quality of life changes. For starters, TP got removed. Before Shadowbringers, TP was the equivalent of mana for physical jobs. This was an amazing change. Many players were not happy with the existence of TP as it felt awkward having to manage a resource like that. Sprinting also costed all of your TP, so you wouldn't be able to use weapon skills after popping sprint. The maximum MP for all jobs got set to 10,000. Different jobs used to have different mana points, but this patch streamlined it all. This was also the patch where the 5% rule got added, in that for each unique role in your party, you will receive a 1% increase to all your stats up to 5%. Finally, tank stances got completely streamlined. Remember before how different tank stances had different effects on your HP, damage, and enmity generation? Now all tanks simply have one stance that they can turn on and off, and the effect of the stance for all tanks were the same. They all generate significantly more enmity when turned on, and that was the extent of the effect. This is also the patch where healer rotations began to become the one button meme that we have today. Healers used to have a couple of dot spells that they would have to maintain, but this patch removed a lot of these spells from their kits. For example, Scholar used to have 3 dots in total: Bio, Miasma, and Shadow Flare. Shadow Flare and Miasma were both removed in Shadowbringers, although Miasma was initially removed in Stormblood, then got re-added towards the end of Stormblood in 4.5, only to be removed again in 5.0. These changes may seem welcome at first, but this was also the start of a design philosophy that would cause controversy in the community later, especially in the next expansion. Eden came into being when Ardbert and his party defeated the Ascians Logrif and Metron. As a result of the mortal blow dealt by Ardbert with his Blade of Light, Metron's body mutated into the first Sin Eater. Metron lost his sense of self as he opened the flood of light that rendered most of the first a lifeless wasteland. This is when Minfilia came in, forcing Eden into a deep slumber to stop the flood. Now 100 years later, the Warrior of Darkness defeats Hades and the Night Sky returns to Norvrant. Reen, the successor to Minfilia, detects another great source of light out in the empty, and basically, to make a long story short, you set off with Reen to restore the empty to its previous form, introducing the Eden Raid tiers. Eden's Gate was the first raid tier of Shadowbringers, and the format of the tier itself was a bit different from the last few tiers. In the Omega raids, it was always that the first 2 floors of a tier were served as more of an introduction to higher end raiding, and the 3rd and 4th floors were the actual difficult fights of the tier. It wasn't uncommon that players would clear the 1st and 2nd floor only to get stuck on a mountainous climb from the 2nd to the 3rd. This isn't exactly how Eden's Gate went. I think the most notable fight here, in terms of prog at least, is E2 Voidwalker. Voidwalker was a fight where a lot of emphasis was placed on personal responsibility. Not to say that the other fights don't require personal responsibility, but Voidwalker in particular doesn't wipe you for it. This fight was a mess in Party Finder, as even if you do your rotation perfectly and don't get hit, it was pretty common that the softened rage called Quietus starts and all of a sudden people just die, whether to just raid wise or getting hit by a bat ad. E3 on the other hand, although easier than E2, was a breath of fresh air for many after getting out of E2 hell. And this is where the slight difference in formatting is, in that E3 would usually be a much harder fight than E2. The most memorable and challenging fight in the tier though is, as usual, the final boss of the tier, Titan. This fight had 3 distinct phases, which is the most phases a Savage fight has ever had up to date. And by phases here, I mean big cinematic transitions. This fight also introduced a new level of elevation in the arena that we've never quite seen before. A little bit of personal bias, but I think the aesthetics for this fight look amazing. Overall, this raid tier was pretty fair and memorable for the player base. There's a few things to say about Eden's verse, and I think that the most notable one is the stagnation of fight design in this particular tier. The mechanics in this tier was generally just reused mechanics from previous tiers. There was less innovation and creativity, meaning that the fights became static and boring to farm after a while. The fights also weren't particularly memorable apart from E8, the final boss of the tier, because it was incredibly hard compared to the rest. The difficulty curve for this tier was non-existent. Savage tiers usually followed a pattern of first floor being slightly above extreme difficulty, second floor expanding on the first floor, complicating the fight a bit more, the third floor being an adequate challenge for Savage raiders, and the fourth floor being a true test of high-end content. However, this tier didn't follow that progression at all. The first 3 floors of the tier were quite simple, and that means that Square Enix loaded most of the difficulty into a single fight, that being E8 Shiva. This tier is also where we start to see raid wides or tank busters being almost always the first cast in the fight. In fact, all 4 fights start off with a raid wide. This was to make sure people had enough time to finish their openers before doing actual mechanics of the fight, but I've seen various people complain about how it was a pain waiting 30 seconds every pull to actually start the real fight. Besides this though, there are some good things about this tier. Primarily that the off-tank had a much more active role than Eden's Gate. In most of Eden's Gate, the off-tank didn't really have much responsibility. There were barely any tank swaps or ads to pick up, making the off-tank feel essentially like a melee DPS until E4S. Eden's verse didn't resonate very well with the community, with the biggest problem being stagnation in terms of mechanic innovation. With this tier, Square Enix would gain some trust back with the community. While last tier struggled with in innovation, this tier definitely stepped up. This was evident in the first fight of the tier, E9 Cloud of Darkness, which was like Fall Guys FF14 edition with a bunch of breakable platforms and memes. It was great because you could make mistakes, kill your teammates, and still clear. It was fun and a very welcome fight after a tier of reused static mechanics. What followed as well, E10 Shadowkeeper, or better known as the Shadow Dog, was fun as well, at least during prog, with unique mechanics of the shadows. That being said, Umbral Orbs were a terrible mechanic. This involved 2 purple and 2 orange orbs that would spawn, which shortly after will attack the players closest to them. Tanks would soak the purple, whilst healers and DPS will soak the orange. It was finicky, buggy, and visually glitched, with the orbs tracking correctly most of the time. E11 was also widely well received, pitting you off against Ranjit and a bit of Thancred. This fight's concept itself was pretty great and had good atmosphere as well. The core thing in this fight was speed. Mechanics would be coming out fast, and you'd have to react and understand them visually and work it out in your head quite fast. Although none of the mechanics in this fight were particularly inspiring or new, they were given out in rapid fashion, making the execution quite fun. And finally E12, which is up there for being one of the best door bosses made, at least mechanics wise. This fight had a good balance between being random and being scripted. Like for the first 1.5 minute of the fight, it's pretty much all random, making each pull feel a bit more refreshing rather than doing the same movement over and over. The final boss, Oracle of Darkness, is also great, introducing new mechanics that focus on time, and the skill to look forward how many seconds in the future to do a mechanic. One of the main criticisms that Shiva had was the cutscene. Every pull had a very long cutscene where you're just forced to sit there doing nothing. It might be cool for the first, second, or maybe even third time, but after doing so many pulls you just get tired of it. They fixed this in E12 because the cutscene occurs from the transition, and so you only get to watch it once in an instance. This makes the pace of the fight itself a lot better. Overall, this tier was pretty great and left quite a good impression on the community. Endwalker was the last expansion in the Scion's journey, and the changes that were brought upon in this expansion were mixed. I think the big thing that started to become clear here is Square Enix's confusion on job identity and complexity. First, let's talk about the big rework here, Summoner. Summoner was known to be a pet magical dot job, but after Endwalker, this changed completely, and now it has no dots and technically no pets. Although the reception to this change was decently positive since old Summoner was pretty jank and clunky, there were also concerns about the job's complexity being reduced drastically. For example, you had control over your pets before, meaning that you had to actually press buttons to make the pet do specific actions, but the new Summoner doesn't need this. Another big change in this patch was that job buffs were all centered around a 2-minute burst cycle, meaning that pretty much all party buffs in this game were changed to a 2-minute cooldown. It used to be that party buff skills like Dragoon's Battle Litany had varying timers like 90 seconds or 180 seconds, etc. And so the party would have to pre-plan burst windows depending on the party composition and fight. Now everyone can almost just always send their burst on cooldown unless the fight dictates otherwise. This was obviously met with mixed responses. Whilst yes, this does make the game easier and many players have expressed their discontent with the 2-minute meta, it also allows Square Enix to specifically design fights around these 2-minute burst windows. Overall, the Endwalker changes leaned even more into streamlining the game for newer players, which did encourage new players but at the same time deterred some of the older players who were into more complex jobs and optimization. Asphodelos was a decent start into the Endwalker raid tiers. P1 and P4 were considered the weaker fights of the tier, whilst P2 was praised and P3 was... P1 was a simple first floor with really only 2 mechanics, that being Fourfold Shackle and Intemperance. Fourfold Shackle was easy once you understood it, and Intemperance didn't have enough variations in the patterns to make it really challenging. The next was P2, the Hippo. This fight was very creative and fun and used the boss arena in a way that we haven't seen before. Water would fill up most of the arena for most of the fight, making the outline of a square as areas to move on. The main mechanic in this fight was Channeling Overflow, where you'll be marked with a front, rear, left or right mark of the tides, which is the debuff that will shoot a point blank AoE from your character, dealing a heavy knockback that will send other players into the wall if hit. A purple arrow will also indicate which direction you'll be moved when the debuff resolves. To solve this, you need to hit the player with the opposite purple arrow direction as you. This mechanic happens twice in the fight, once when the arena is fully open to move, and once again when the arena is filled with water. Positioning becomes exceedingly important, especially in the second cast. This fight also had points where you could use your knockback resist to negate some mechanics. Overall, it was a very fun and creative fight that was received quite well. And now to possibly the most mixed fight of this tier, P3 the Phoenix. The thing that made this fight difficult was the execution. Almost all of the mechanics had been from previous fights, especially with some callouts back to turn 12 of the Coil of Bahamut. However, the execution checks combined with the awful color choice on this fight made it a hell in Party Finder. A decent amount of players liked this fight, and a hell of a lot of players despised this fight, calling it garbage and remarkably boring in terms of its mechanics. Finally, we move on to P4, which also wasn't well received, as Phase 2 disappointed a lot of players with its lackluster mechanics. Funny enough, the hardest mechanic in this fight was in Phase 1, actually called Pinax, where the 4 quadrants of the arena will explode in a random order, each quadrant having their own mechanics. Asphodelos was a decent first tier, but a lot of players felt it to be too simple, and the difficulty spike of P3 when compared to P1 and P2 also threw people off. Abyssos is quite possibly the most memorable tier in Endwalker for one reason: the final boss of this tier, P8S. But let's not get too hasty and start from P5. The main mechanic that would have a pretty large impact on the raid scene is Devour. This mechanic spawned 8 blue towers around the arena, and a red mouth marker will hover over each of the 8 towers in sequence, indicating the order in which the boss will leap to the towers. Each time the boss leaps to a tower, a large AoE will appear under, and if you're caught by it, then you'll get stunned and eventually eaten. Some people hated this mechanic, and some people liked it, but overall this fight was seen as a pretty good first floor. P6 was ass. This fight is widely considered to be one of the worst second floors because it wasn't fun, the mechanics were non-existent. The only mechanic that was interesting was Cachexia, but this could just be cheese with tank LB. P7 was a treat. Similar to P6, this was considered pretty bad. The fight is backloaded, with interesting mechanics only happening at about 35% onwards. Sleep for 6 minutes, but wake up for the last 2. The real savage level mechanics come with the harvests at the end of the fight, but you can just again cheese it through healer LB, so it doesn't even matter. Now let's talk about the real fight of the tier, P8. This is undeniably the most impactful fight of this tier by far, because of one thing: the DPS check. This fight single-handedly made Square Enix realize how bad their job balance was, with Yoshi P even apologizing and acknowledging that they fucked up, and that the top percentage of players were overwhelmingly better at the game than they were. Jobs would be excluded in party finders, and even when this wasn't the case, you probably weren't clearing if you had a warrior or a paladin in the party. The DPS disparity between Dark Knights and Gunbreakers when compared to warriors and paladins was a joke. In fact, on very early week 1, there had only been 1 warrior and 1 paladin clear, as opposed to a lot more Gunbreaker and Dark Knights. This also spawned the famous clip of Xeno struggling to clear the DPS check on warrior, but cleared it first try on Gunbreaker. Apart from the tanks, the disparity between the healer DPS was also quite big, making this fight a horror to clear. It was so bad that Square Enix nerfed the boss HP by 1% on patch. Their reason for having such a high initial HP was that during testing, their team's performance proved to be higher than usual, and hence they upped the HP slightly to make it a tighter fight for the top players. A big thing to note here is the fight design itself, namely that it was a 2 timeline fight. Let me explain. The boss has 2 forms it can take at a certain point in the fight: Centaur or Snake. Once this boss turns into this form, it'll turn into the other form 6 minutes afterwards. This split the fight into 2 possible timelines, one where the Snake is the first and one where the Centaur is first. The good one here that we want is Snake, because it's a longer mechanic and people don't need to spread out for the 2-minute burst. However, Centaur was a shorter mechanic and required players to spread out afterwards. So if you got Centaur first, you would do the mechanic and then be required to spread out, but your 2-minute burst was during the spread, making this 2-minute window pretty AIDS. A lot of the party buffs also weren't 30 yarms, and so it would be difficult sometimes to hit everyone with your party buff during the spread. The fight itself though is very good. Apart from the broken DPS check, players expressed their contentment with mechanics like high concept, mid check, heal checks, and of course the most important mechanic, music. With how much impact this fight had on the scene, it went down as one of the most remembered fights in the entire expansion, if not the most remembered. The tier overall was mediocre, with P6 and P7 being possibly the worst fights of the expansion. Anabasios was mostly a step up from Abyssos in terms of quality of the fights, but there are a few pointers that take it down a notch. For one, the DPS check was non-existent. Second, there was a clear theme in the mechanics of this tier, body checks. And though some people might find the body check mechanics to be good since it makes the tier more punishing and hence more difficult, a lot of people also found it to be a slog and bad design for savage level content. All the fights here were pretty good, apart from maybe P11, which was collectively agreed to be quite boring. The absolute most notable fight here is P10, which is amongst one of the best second floors to be made, if not the best. It was difficult, more difficult than some of the fourth floors and almost every third floor, so much in fact that it was pretty much agreed upon by the entire community that P10 should have been the third floor. The entire fight had very tight execution. Stack spreads with little room to work with, tank towers, etc. A large wall in this fight was harrowing hell, a massive multi-hit raid wide that required insane mitigation and healing. In fact, these raid wides went for so long that tank mids would often fall off before the mechanic even ended. P11 was not very good and its mechanics were very similar to Fatebreaker from E11, so it was basically just a remastered E11. There wasn't anything new or creative and just fell flat compared to the other fights of this tier. The door boss for P12 was fantastic. This boss had a limit cut which works the same from previous fights, but introduced untargetable adds that do extra mechanics. This mechanic was very scary with the amount of damage output and the mechanic itself. The final boss, Pallas Athena though, was less welcome. Not that it was considered bad, but because the spread of difficulty across mechanics is mismatched. There are some war mechanics and also some nothing mechanics because they're so easy. For example, the first 1.5 minutes into the fight is basically non-existent. The majority of people agree that the door boss was fantastic, but that the final boss was a notch lower. P9 and P12 are both solid fights, better than a lot of other respective floors, and P10 was great, so the whole tier was pretty good. Better than the other tiers this expansion had. Despite the common criticisms of the story and the mostly negative reviews on Steam as a result of that, Dawntrail's battle content is pretty great. They introduced 2 jobs this patch, Viper and Pictomancer, one which pumps in uptime fights and one which is absolutely broken in downtime fights. This expansion patch didn't really touch on previous system mechanics like the 2-minute meta, but rather focused on job specific adjustments and new abilities. The Arcadion was an entertainment venue built in Solution 9 where combatants utilized the souls of feral beasts in arenas. It was the #1 entertainment venue for people but closed down when Zorolja directed all resources towards the war against Tuliolol. After the war and death of Alexandria's queen, Sphene, the handler and announcer of the Arcadion, Medum, reopened the arena to bring joy for the people grieving the loss of their queen. He spotted the Warrior of Light and offered them to fight in the upcoming tournament as they were the one who protected the people of Alexandria from Zorolja. The AAC Light Heavyweight tier had incredible music and visuals with the whole arena being held inside what looks like an oversized GPU. They also introduced new fun announcer voice lines whenever someone dies. But that's really it. The fights themselves lacked substance. The DPS checks were virtually non-existent and the difficulty of the entire tier was at an all-time low. In fact, it was so easy that the World First Team Grind cleared the entire tier in under 10 hours. Arguably, the only memorable fight of this tier was M2, and it wasn't even because the fight was particularly hard or unique in any sense, but rather because the music was kind of a meme and Alarm's Pheromones won. AP1 was a mechanic that spawned many bees on the edge of the arena which would cast line AoEs after a while of spawning. Since there isn't exactly a pattern to how these bees spawned, it made a pretty chaotic time in Party Finder since the early strat was just to YOLO dodge the lines. This boss also had a mechanic where if players messed up in certain mechanics, it would gain a permanent stack of Queen Bee which heals her for 1% and increases her damage dealt. Sometimes when the boss had 3 or 4 stacks, this would make the DPS check impossible on the first week. I guess the other notable thing was the usage of pink or purple indicators for close or far baits in M4S Witch Hunt. This indicator was first shown in Mount Rockon in its final boss, but this is the first time that it was used in Savage. I'm assuming that this is going to be a common indicator in the future since the most extreme also used it. I don't really have anything more to say on this tier. Community sentiment was that the tier was fun, but very easy. And we finally arrived. The most recent tier, AAC Cruiserweight. This tier was definitely a step up from the last tier. Like last tier, the tier had amazing visuals and in my opinion weaker music, but that's up to you to decide. Most importantly however, the tier was more unique and much more difficult. Every fight is so different with their own set of mechanics and twists. And they finally brought back ads. In fact, all the fights in this tier apart from M5 had an ads phase. M5 was a great tier starter. The mechanics were fun to do, the dancing spotlights were unique, and the music matching the mechanics was a great touch. M6 is incredibly creative, making the fight quite fun to do. This fight also has a very infamous ads phase and was a killer in Party Finder. Essentially, there are 4 waves of animal ads that spawn, and every ad that spawns apart from the mantas have a hard enrage timer. Positioning of the ads was very important as you would want the most cleave possible, and so the main tank would have to be a shepherd and move the ads around correctly while spreading mitigation. The off tank on the other hand just stays north and gets smacked by Yans. This fight spawned so many memes of these creatures on Twitter, and it was the only thing you would see of the tier. Similarly, P7 was unique as well in that it had 3 phases and 3 arenas, in which it goes from a normal boss to a wall boss. But before talking about M7S, I want to mention M7 Normal. The normal version of this fight might be the best normal third floor they've ever made. It was very fast and punishing for a normal fight. The raid wides actually dealt damage and mistakes costed you. The Savage version in turn wasn't that much more difficult. When considering the difficulty difference between M6 Normal and M6 Savage, this waned in comparison. Finally, M8, a fight where speed is the key. The mechanics for this fight came out very fast and you would have to properly pre-position for mechanics since the boss AoE indicators are very short. This tier is quite innovative in a few ways. First, there are almost no mechanics where you'd have to recall to a previous mechanic or cast. For example, in M2 there would be spreads or stacks dependent on the cast bar that was cast 1 minute ago. The only time this existed this tier was M5 where you would have to remember light party stacks or roll stacks. Second, it seems that Square Enix has started to remember some of these abilities that are almost never used in raiding and are bringing them in. The only ability that was useful in Savage before was knockback resist, and even that was quite rare. This tier required players to use stuns and interrupts, so it was a nice change of pace. Finally, the tank busters in this tier are really a step up in that they often involve the entire party. Tank busters before this tier would just pop 2 cooldowns or invuln on the tank and then maybe tank swap if you needed. The tank busters in this tier are special because they all have some sort of condition. In M6 it targets the closest and furthest player so the whole party has to position as well, similar in M7. Overall, this tier signifies a pretty bright future for Final Fantasy raiding, especially after last tier. And we've reached the end. Across all of Final Fantasy raiding history, so much has changed, especially from A Realm Reborn and Heavensward days. From missing positionals breaking combos, the existence of TP to the start of the 2-minute meta, the game has evolved quite a bit. I hope this video has given you an entertaining insight to past FF14 system mechanics and raid tiers. Thank you for watching.